Hey, how's everyone doing today? I would like to talk about limited government. Um, Unfortunately, the debate that I I don't I didn't really moderate so much, unfortunately, but the debate with Stefan Kinsella and Jen Helfeld did not really engage in a debate. There was a lot of fighting, machismo, um, and it's good for a few laughs, but it's sort of a waste of time if you want a real debate. So I thought I'd just comment myself about some of the problems with Minarchy, or some of the things um, that Jan was saying. First of all, I think if you are going to argue for a government, what you need to do isn't just say there are problems in the world, uh, and therefore we need a government. What you have to do is say how a government will solve these problems or will reduce these problems, not just saying that there's this problem. So, for example, one common argument, and I think Jan touched upon this, with anarchy is that people disagree on what constitutes aggression. There's disagreement on what constitutes aggression. Does abortion violate the rights of the fetus, or does prohibiting abortion violate the rights of the mother? Is intellectual property legitimate, or is intellectual property an oxymoron? So there are disagreements on what constitutes aggression. And if you don't have a government, it's not so clear that the agencies of private defense will be defense. Who says the agencies will be defensive, right? It's possible to have a government military which is aggressive, so why isn't it possible, likewise, if you privatize these things, for them to turn the guns on the people that they're supposed to protect? People disagree on what constitutes violence, and therefore, without a central agency, people will be constant disputes and constant arguments. Well, there's a few responses to this that I think is important to give. One is, if there is this disagreement, and it's not so clear what constitutes aggression, then how is it solved by having a state? How does the government know what constitutes aggression or not? How is it that the politicians have this magic power where they know what the difference is between aggression and defense, but people outside the political arena don't? Is there this magic machine where once you enter the political process, you enter the machine and suddenly you have all this information that you didn't have beforehand? So I would argue that if people don't know what constitutes aggression or not, the problem is not solved by having a state. All you're going to have when you have a state is institutionalized, monopolized violations of people's rights. If people don't know what constitutes aggression, that means politicians don't know what constitutes aggression. And instead of having different defense agencies or different agencies of force and different rules, now you have a monopoly of rules. And if the rules themselves are victimless crimes, instead of having one agency or two agencies or one region that's bad, now it's throughout the entire country you have it, right? This is one of the arguments for states' rights versus a federal government. Both the federal government and the state can be equally oppressive, but the more decentralized it is, the more options you have, right? One of the reasons a one-world government would be a hell on earth is now whatever the law is, you have nowhere else to go. Where if you believe in abortion and the law says no abortion, or vice versa, you can't go anywhere else that allows abortion or prohibits abortion or what have you. So the argument I would argue for states' rights over the federal government, or city rights over state rights, and street rights over city rights, and individual rights over street rights, is that you have more options. It's easier to leave a state than easier to leave an entire country. And it's easier to, and so decentralization is the answer. So I would argue that, yes, it's possible that people will disagree on what constitutes aggression or not, but the problem isn't solved by having a state. All that's solved by having a state is now it's monopolized the law. And if the law becomes a victimless crime, then you're in trouble. And I would argue that we want people to talk about these issues. There's nothing wrong with people who disagree on what constitutes aggression. But the way this problem is solved isn't by saying, let's have a group of people with the vast majority of amount of weapons to decide for us what constitutes aggression or not. Because then we're just following a leader, and it's blind obedience, and the government is not limited and can do whatever the hell it wants to do. A better way to solve these issues is to talk about them, is to discuss them, right? If I disagree with you on an issue, the best way to solve it is by saying, hey, let's have a debate. Let's have a discussion, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to have that debate. Saying, let just the government decide, I don't think is an answer. It's a lazy answer. It's saying, why think, let them decide. Another problem with minarchy, and this is related to the first part, is that the check is the people. That the check of to make sure that the government lives within its confines is the people. Because, of course, no person is ever going to limit their own power, right? You know, if I was charged of paying me, I'll always give myself a raise. You know, if I stole your watch and I get to be the judge, of course I'm going to say you gave it to me as a gift. So yes, we need the people to be some type of check to make sure that the government is not oppressive, and that the government limits itself. But of course that contradicts the first problem that minarchists say, right? If you're going to argue that people don't know what constitutes aggression or not, then how do they know when the government is acting aggressively or not? Right? Don't they need the government to tell them what aggression is? That's why you argued for a state. If they do, then how do they know when the government itself is acting aggressively or not? And if they don't know without the government telling them, then what kind of check is that on governmental power? So the people themselves, before you set up any type of government, you must have a system of morality. A prerequisite must be that the vast majority of people know what is right or wrong. Because if they don't know what is right or wrong, then the people who are in the government are not necessarily going to have a system of ethics. Since if you have a democratic society, they're not going to vote with people who are saying, I'm going to limit myself and only use violence under a limited number of cases and only during these circumstances. So if we live in a society where the people seek political power, and yes, minarchists are arguing that government is established through voting, that means the voters themselves must have a system of ethics beforehand. And if the vast majority of people understand what constitutes aggression or not, then you don't need a government. It's clear what constitutes aggression, and whenever a private defense agency is acting aggressively, people are going to know that it is acting aggressively and not engaging in defense, and then we'll fight against that defense agency. And I would argue it's much easier to defend yourself against a guy who wants to rob your home than to take on the entire IRS. It's much easier to defend yourself against a private defense agency that turns aggressive than the United States military or the police. I'll take my chances under anarchy, because I'm not saying I'm going to be able to defend myself against a thief who raids my home, but I have a much better chance than taking on the government, which has nuclear weapons, which has the vast majority of consent among its citizenry. Another problem with minarchy is that it's contradictory, right? It basically, forget the fact that taxation is violence for a minute. The fact that what minarchy is arguing for is that a group of people have the right to do something which no one else can do, right? If you watch Jan's debates, he says you can't delegate a right you do not have, which means that there's only really one of two possibilities. Either the services government is providing, or at least some of them, are legitimate, or they are not. If the services government are providing are legitimate, they're not legitimate because the government's doing it. They are legitimate in and of themselves. It's not right. It's not, well, if the government's doing it, then it's okay. It's either okay to have a police force or a military or a court system, or it's not. If it's not, the government itself is violating people's rights by having a military, a police, and court system. If it is legitimate to have police, military, and a court system, and I would argue that it is, the government violates people's rights by throwing into jail other people who are acting the exact same way as government. They are saying, if you set up the exact same agencies of defense as I do, I will throw you into jail. Government is violating people's rights. Now, what I would say is that we want people who are critical thinkers, right? In order for a limited government to even exist, it's not going to exist by voting for some guy, hoping he's the Messiah and will turn the country around. If you believe voting for a candidate is going to change a country to a limited government, however you define that, you're living in a dream world. The only way limited government is even possible is if the majority of the population has the philosophy of the minarchists. And the same thing is true with anarchy. The way anarchy is possible is if the vast majority of people support the philosophy of anarchy and are willing and are not compliant with the government's rules and are willing to defend themselves against the violence of the state, where the government just ceases to be because it's dysfunctional. But I would argue once that's true, you're surrounded by people who believe in the philosophy of anarchy and know what constitutes violence or not, and are against the initiation of the use of force. So this whole idea of people just bombing other people and getting a tank and throwing people out is crazy. There's disputes between governments, Jan. Unless you're arguing for a one-world government, what happens when governments disagree? That's called war. Is that really what you want? And I would argue that war is expensive, and when the costs are socialized, you're more apt to go to war than if you have to pay for it yourself. If a private defense agency has to pay for war himself or has to charge higher prices to go to war and also pay his workers more, because the riskier the job is, the more I need to be compensated with a higher income by taking on added risk, a defense agent, an agency which engages disputes by solving it through violence, is going to have to charge way higher prices than one that solves it peacefully, which means it's not going to be in business very long. But when you have a monopolized state and you don't have to worry about competition, you have a guaranteed income, you don't really have, and the costs are socialized to people, whether they agree with it or not, you're more apt to go to war. So those are the problems with minarchy. I would argue that, I'm not a utopian. I don't think that if you get rid of the state, everyone's going to live nice and hold hands. To me, getting rid of the state is like executing a mass murderer. One less murderer we have to deal with. That's it. That's it. Getting rid of the state means we have one agency of defense which no longer exists. It doesn't mean that no one is ever going to kill. Government is not the only agency which engages in violence. They're just the biggest. So that is really the problem that I have with minarchy. I have some other ideas. I sort of forgot them now, but if I remember them, I'll put them in another video. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Take care. Bye.